Thank you very much to the Leopoldina for the invitation. I had not realized it was apparently the oldest scientific society in the world. And thank you very much to be with you in Berlin today. I'll try to share some perspectives from the work we have developed at the OECD. I've been trying to develop this agenda since 2015-16 when we received a political mandate at the Helsinki Ministerial Meeting on Public Governance to promote some sort of a what works perspective in the OECD work on public governance. And just to clarify that the OECD has many committees, and so some of the work that had been better known until now was the specific DAC criteria for development aid, but we have been working since 2015 to engage with OECD countries on how OECD countries themselves could evaluate what their own government was doing. And in fact, we were lucky in recent years because there were a lot of problems. Governments have been facing what's the so-called wicked issues, and also a very strong erosion of trust and the challenges of mis and disinformation. And I think, in a sense, the COVID-19 crisis was an accelerator for this agenda because governments, from the day to the next, were left without any evidence to address very significant issues, whether to shut down the economy or not, and had very limited evidence. And in many countries, this led to very fast changes, both at the centers of government and to try to identify the right experts, set up some good governance frameworks, and it was some form of an accelerator. And suddenly, the word resilience became a buzzword because in all countries, that's what we wanted, and in the OECD, we have also overused that word as well. But evidence was important to improve the effectiveness of public administration. However, once we've said that, what is it that we can do? What are the policy actionable drivers? Because we need trusted evidence and science, and usually in OECD countries there is abundant science. We have very large universities, but we don't know necessarily how to make sure that some of this evidence, some of the science can be used in government. And for that, you just need tools and methods with an impact. And in fact, the better regulation frameworks, which has been significantly developed in Germany since the 2013 reforms, is part of the answers, but it's not the only answer. You need to somehow bring evidence to the policy process, and you also need to mobilize data, which I understand in Germany is quite an issue. You would also say, but why does this matter? That's what Rolf Alter was asking me this morning. We need to show the benefits. And there is no easy answer to that, Rolf. The first answer is that there is all the cost of all the mistakes that you have avoided by good policy-making processes within government. I was reminded that I started my career in the Ministry of Finance in France. I was, in fact, part of an advisory economic analysis unit. And my director was always saying, when I have a happy day, I've been able to kill 10 crazy ideas of our politicians. So just because we were able to promote, to make people think, no, if you do that, this and this and this will happen, and then people can rethink a little bit, and that's an outcome. But of course, it's a difficult outcome to measure. And in fact, I've been very lucky because the OECD has developed an OECD survey on trust in government. And in fact, for the second edition of Trust, with some intense lobbying on my behalf within the organization, we were able to include specific questions on the role of evidence-informed policymaking. In fact, I was very happy about the results because, in fact, whether citizens think that people's confidence that the government uses evidence and facts in taking decisions has, in fact, a very strong correlation with trust in government. You would say, I'm sure there are many social scientists in the room, or Stéphane, that's just a correlation, you know, and there are lots of spurious correlations around. But this is not spurious correlation. I would direct you to the trust survey analysis. There has also been econometric analysis of the drivers. And this factor, the belief that government uses evidence to drive decisions, is one of the strongest drivers in econometric terms of confidence in national government. So in a sense, we have some form of a proof of concept that this matter, and that should give some rationale for governments to invest in this. And in fact, we have been using and promoting these results quite a bit. It does not necessarily mean that evidence is crucial for democracy. In fact, when I worked in recent years and we had contacts with the Russian administration, the Russians were coming to me and saying, you know, President Putin is very concerned about the effectiveness of our government, and we think we need to do a lot about it. And both authoritarian regimes can also be concerned with efficient government. So it is in the interest of the people. However, it matters for trust in government, and trust in government in democratic settings is very important because of current policy and political debates, which I think are happening in Germany as well as in my own country, unfortunately, as you can see at the moment, have a lot of implications for how governments can work. Now, we were thinking as to, once we've said this matters and set the framework, how can we move to some form of the implementation phase, and how can we connect this with the evaluation of laws? And I was trying to think at the German situation in retrospect when I compared to other countries. Yesterday afternoon I was in The Hague because we were delivering a final study on the Dutch system for evidence-informed policy making. And in the Netherlands, they have a very wonderful evaluation sort of so-called knowledge brokers. They have well-known institutions such as the WRR, the Planning Bureau, the PBL, the Planning Agency. They have very advanced science, but in fact, they seem to have a bit of an issue on how to make use of that science. So it doesn't mean that when you have a rich system, you don't necessarily mean that it all feeds in a nice way into policy settings. And when I look at Germany, I'm a little bit puzzled because you seem to have very focused technical elements that are surely very important, like this ex-ante digital checks, the implementation science, looking at the consequences, that's super useful. But ex-ante, the evaluation, as was mentioned by Mrs. Professor Kuhlmann, seems to be a bit limited or doesn't go very much in depth. However, Germany ex-post has relatively strong criteria, and when you look at the regulatory outlook, I have here with me the copy of the forthcoming 2025 outlook, which is for consultations. I'm not going to disclose any too confidential results, but you all know that at least in this way, the data that have been put forward by my colleagues, Germany looks a bit above the OECD average. Not that it should be fully reassuring for a country like Germany, but at least there is something. However, what we are not sure, and my big question, and I'd be happy to discuss bilaterally with some of you today, is you cannot have evidence-driven policymaking if you do not have capacity to produce evidence in the ministries and capacity to use that evidence. And it seems that the system in Germany is a bit patchy, or that there is no system at all, if you allow me, that in some areas there are some strong analytical points, and in other areas there are big gaps. The other area for evidence to inform policymaking is in budgets. And in fact, normally you need to have some coherence between your strategic planning systems and focusing on spending priorities. And in countries that are relatively well organized in this area, such as the United Kingdom and Ireland, there are mechanisms whereby the Cabinet Office or the Department of Public Expenditure and Reforms are working jointly with other core government agencies to, in a sense, ensure the coherence between political priorities for spending and effectiveness, that is bringing spending reviews together with policy evaluation, which is something that the Cabinet Office does, and that in Ireland is also done through the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. And also a very interesting country, I think, for Germany would be to look at Canada, where another federal country, where the Treasury Board Secretariat, for any new budget request, looks at the effectiveness of spending. Of course, in recent years, Germany has made significant progress. I also have with me, it's publicly available, the OECD reports on spending reviews in Germany. Germany has tried to develop spending reviews as a relatively strong governance framework. However, from what I have seen, they are sometimes focused on relatively limited or technical topics, and also the links with evidence do not seem to be so clear. So in this area, I could also refer you to the examples, for example, of the Netherlands, where the strategic evaluation agenda driven by the Dutch Ministry of Finance has been a pretty strong element in terms of driving effectiveness in the Netherlands in recent years. Just to also say what we at the OECD have been doing, which has been driving our action, as was mentioned by our colleague from Deval, I had the honor to lead this study of 44 OECD countries improving governance through policy evaluation, which for the first time gave a cross-country overview of the landscape. And out of that and other work, we were able to develop an OECD recommendation of the Council on public policy evaluation, which in turn gives us the capacity to conduct survey, to support implementation, and to reach out to countries. And the team has set out a toolkit in 2024, which I think is will become available soon. It was just discussed in our editorial board yesterday. And our colleagues in the better regulation area have also developed, I'm sure Rolf knows that because I think this was still done under his time, have developed good practice reports. So these are not fully recommendations. These are good practice reports, both for ex-ante and ex-post evaluation. Now I'm going to share with you some results of the 2023 survey. So after we had done our recommendation, we were able to launch a survey with 30 countries, and that still was discussed in our working groups, but not necessarily published. And we see that requirements for conducting policy evaluation stem from various sources. They can come from international commitments, and in fact, in many countries, the European Union has been a big driver for efficiency because the use of resilience funds comes with requirements for evaluation, and historically, European cohesion policy also came with strings attached. If you go to many of the Eastern European member states, a lot of their evaluation capacity is only linked to the evaluation of regional funds, of European funds, and the rest of the government was quite deprived. It's quite striking. There are also requirements to do evaluations from the government strategic plans and programs, and also above certain budgetary thresholds, like in Germany, above the 2 million. In the Netherlands, they have also the Article 3.1, where measures above a certain budget thresholds have to be evaluated. And there are also some countries, a smaller level of countries, where there are no requirements. The second thing that still holds from the work that we did in 2018-19 and again in the survey in 2023 is that the big drivers of evaluations across government are still ministries of finance or institutions at the center of government. However, I must say in Germany, I don't think that you have either of these two, given the relatively decentralized nature of the German government, the fragmented nature, and the fact that I don't think the Chancellery had the scope or the responsibilities or the capacity, I don't mean in the technical capacity, but the political mandate to conduct such a cross-government agenda. And in some countries, you also have autonomous agencies and ministries of the public sector. I should also say that when we have discussed with our Nordic colleagues, they've been critical of our OECD approach, so we have to be lucid about the limits also of what we've been doing, because when you go to Nordic countries, they don't necessarily have a framework, a driver. However, they have a very rich evaluation system. They have sectoral institutes, the agencies. If you go to Sweden, to Norway, they have huge evaluation teams, and they have a culture of evaluation. So it's embedded in their practice without necessarily being mandated. The other thing that we can say from our survey is that responsibilities of evaluation champions differ based on where they are based. If you look at the centers of government, they tend to conduct or commission cross-sectoral policy evaluations. And however, if you look at the, and also ministries of finance tend to manage cross-government evaluations agendas, such as the strategic evaluation agenda in the Netherlands. When you look more at the centers of government, they tend to provide guidelines to advise on best practices. I should also say that if I look at my results in a humble way, a lot of the results for centers of government are in fact linked to they have responsibilities for driving better regulation. So ministries of finance, these are requirements for better spending guidelines, and often centers of government are often related to, not always, but to their functions as coordinating legislation for government. Now, what can you do to achieve change in this area? You can provide high-level guidance, as was mentioned. You can try to embed evaluation in decision-making, which is partly done in Germany, I mean, in the better regulation process with some significant requirements. The follow-up mechanisms for ex-post evaluation are quite interesting, the ones that are, for example, put in Germany, and I can see that apparently there are some results from what our colleague from DeVal said. You also should promote access to evaluation results. Across OECD countries, they are mostly available by default, but what we realize is that often countries and governments do not know which evaluations have been done. They do not know how to access them. They lack a central portal. They lack methods for doing also systematic reviews. And so they can be accessible, but no one knows where and how to access them. And there is also a need to support the update of evaluation results, for example, to promote tailored and accessible formats, to promote knowledge synthesis, and also to promote innovative presentations. I guess some of you are familiar with the UK What Works Centres and the strengths of evaluation, the way that the UK What Works Centres do communicate in a synthetic way the results of the evaluations is quite striking and should be an inspiration for many. What we have done, and I wanted to spend a few minutes, if you allow me as well, is in recent years we have been fortunate because we have received a big impetus from the TSI program of the European Commission, where we have led a cross-country study with the Joint Research Centre, the GRC, where we have developed a common framework and we have analyzed practices for evidence-informed policymaking in 7 European countries to date. We are currently finalizing that study with a synthesis report to be published next year. And I'm also happy to say that we are working on another set of 5 to 7 countries to be undertaken and started next year, with a number of large European countries being involved in the process. When we did this analysis, we were trying to see how can we evaluate an evaluation systems, which is the questions that our 2 previous speakers said. So we scratched our head and worked a lot and discussed together, and we thought that we would look at the supply of evidence and the demand of evidence. We also looked at, there is a school on these issues. South African researchers had done interesting work, so we thought we would look at the individual, the organizational, and the inter-organizational aspects. And we were looking both at science for policy, that is how science can engage and make its results in a way that is useful for government, and how can government demand evidence. And this approach has led us to these country studies, and we have a number of results. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but we, for example, find that there is a need to identify relevant skills within government. That means you need to have competency frameworks among civil servants. You also need to identify which civil servants do have a minimum of analytical skills. In the countries we studied, there are countries, the Eastern European countries, that have professions of so-called policy planners. We don't know exactly what that means, but a broad range of people with some skills, but not very clear skills for policy analysis. And as best practice examples, some countries have set up specific policy analysis tracks. We can refer you to the Irish Government Economic Evaluation Service, because Ireland, like many Eastern European countries, had only an industry for evaluation focused on regional and policy cohesion funds when it was hit badly by the economic crisis in 2012. And then they realized they had to cut government expenditure by 20% without having any idea on the effectiveness of what they were cutting. So that scared them a lot, and they decided to build capacity for analysis in the government, whereby the central government department, the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, decided to train and also to hire a commonly group of professional economists who could work both in spending departments and the oversight finance department, the expenditure and reform. And this now, for a small country of 4 million, they have a group of 250 professional economists who know each other, who work as a network, and who can organize this dialogue and think in a strategic way about the efficiency of government expenditure. The French system also has had such a system. I'm one of the sons of the descendants of this system, which was created in France out of the trauma of World War II, the defeat, and the French decided to create a modern school of economic analysis that would equip the government with a specific school called ENSAE, attached to the National Statistical Institute, and a cross-sectoral unit of analysts called INSEE administrators, which have been equipping the French government and its analytical departments over the past 50 years. There is also a second need, which is to encourage collaboration in siloed organizations. I think something that doesn't seem to happen too much in Germany, but the problem is you have departments who conduct evidence in silos, and you need to somehow make governments work together on these evidence agendas. And here we have identified good practices in setting cross-agency priority goals, for example, in New Zealand's collective accountability program, or in Belgium, when we did some work, the Belgium Science Policy Office is now promoting multidisciplinary agendas and inviting ministries to somehow share their research program so that they could identify cross-disciplinary issues across 3, 4, or 5 strategy goals. And if you look at the Netherlands, there are large bodies like the WRR, the CPB, have very wide mandates, and they engage together. They also the heads of these organizations sit on the meetings of the boards of the ministries so that they are able also to forge some form of a collective vision. Another issue is about the need for integrating data. I was just having a quick word with Dr. Fitzenberger this morning. Apparently in the labor market domain, it works well in Germany because there is a provision in the social code that says that data should be used. But in other domains, the situation doesn't seem to be so bright in Germany, to say it in a diplomatic way. And we found that many countries in our sample had big issues. Governments do not know how to access data. In Belgium, it takes 2 to 3 years very often to process any data request. That means you have the data by the time your evaluation needs to be done. And there are some good practice examples. For example, the Dutch Statistics Agency has a single access point. Denmark has a single access point. New Zealand has integrated data systems. And if you go to the Nordic countries, they have a long tradition. But I also realize that in countries like Germany, the trauma of the war and the issues of data management are also a strong element in the policy framework. You also need to strengthen demand of evidence. How can you strengthen demand for evidence? First, you need to create capacity to absorb evidence within the government. You can say that, be a bit skeptical, but you need to create positions which materialize the evidence to policy interface, such as chief economists, chief science officers, chief statisticians. You know, someone like Peter Gluckman, who has had a very visionary goal, and I don't know if some of you have met him over the years, have created such positions. My colleagues in the joint research centers do believe in the role of chief science advisors and also creating networks of chief science advisors across ministries. Some countries like Estonia have such networks, and Spain, with Pedro Sanchez, just launched a system like this on the train last week. They announced that they are equipping all their government departments with such science advisors. At the organizational level, you need some systematic knowledge management tools, because often government doesn't know what is the evidence, or you need to create some form of databases, searchable databases or portals. Otherwise, you're left to the notion you have to ask the person who worked here for some years, oh yes, we did a study on this. I'm sure you're familiar with these challenges, and the notion of finding clear portals for governments to know how they can mobilize their gray literature, because not all of this is published in English-speaking journals that have searchable databases. So I think for a lot of countries that are not in the English-speaking world, it is a challenge where you need to self-organize this access. And at the inter-organizational level, you need to create whole-of-government working plans. That is to, for example, share the evaluation agendas and make sure that government evaluation plans are brought together, which is the case, for example, in the United States with the evidence-building plans, in Canada or in the Netherlands, where each of the ministries have to develop evaluation agendas, or in Canada, where all these evaluation plans are brought together by the Treasury Board. So these were some quick highlights from our study. And how can you move forward in the future? You have to invest in competence, in capacities. And I think in Germany it's promising. I heard that we will hear today Dr. Iris Meyer speak about the capacity center from the statistical office in Germany. So it's quite important. You have to invest both in analytical skills and also in the skills to demand evidence, to know how to mobilize evidence. In our project, we not only did country studies, but we also did training programs where we created programs to train civil servants on how to engage with evidence. We did training programs on how to develop knowledge brokerage skills. So these are the sort of skills that you have to develop. You also have to strengthen, and also science for policy skills for scientists, which is something that the GRC has been doing for quite some years. You have to strengthen tools and processes, that is like the better regulation tools, which I think are quite well developed in Germany, so that's not an issue. You need to strengthen the link between spending and regulatory decisions, and also manage the risk of capture. We haven't discussed that, but for evidence to be trusted, which was one of the challenges during COVID, you need to make sure that the people who speak about the evidence cannot be, you know, even scientists are not neutral, and there are issues of conflict of interest. And you need to address these issues of conflict of interest in a very thorough way if you want the advice to be trusted and ministers to be able, vis-à-vis the citizens, to take decisions in a way that everyone will follow. And you need to promote systemic approaches. There is no one-size-fits-all. You can create science advisors, you can create networks of evaluators, networks of data scientists, and you can create governance frameworks to engage government departments. I understand in Germany, creating these governance frameworks is not necessarily easy or realistic, given the fragmented nature of your government, but you can work with some looser approaches or technical approaches where you have networks of people, of professional communities. I guess this is, I will try to conclude at this stage because maybe I've been a bit long. There is no miracle or silver bullet in this area. You just have to explore the space between political trade-offs and expertise. The goal is not to somehow have scientifically driven political decisions, but to make sure that policymakers and ministers or their advisors are able to balance all the trade-offs to take the decisions. So it's to make sure that at least people are making them aware of the relative costs of all the decisions. You have to, for that, to build mechanisms to facilitate knowledge exchange, coordination, and capacity for policy coherence. And as mentioned, that the goal is to reduce the scope for entropy, errors, and limit idiosyncrasies. It doesn't mean that political life and democracies being what they are, you will not have some form of entropy, but at least you can somehow reduce the worst. And as I had mentioned, you have to do this humble work of looking at the tools, the processes, institutions, the skills to ensure robustness, validity, and capacity for policy implementation. I just wish someday we had the capacity to engage with Germany in a more structured way in this agenda, and I very much look forward to the discussions today. Thank you very much.